In my imagination, I think of the four gospel writers discussing among themselves the process of writing and what it meant to be inspired by the Holy Spirit to exegete the life of Jesus. We exegete the Gospels because they exegeted the life of Jesus. We don't know what any one of the Gospel writers looked like, but we do know that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are something of the north, south, east, and west of the Gospel story. They're the bass, the tenor, the alto, the soprano. No two people describe any story alike, let alone four people. But there is a tremendous sense of harmony in these four gospel writers. If you were to ask me which of them would give the longest sermon, what do you think? My vote would be for John. I think John would preach the longest sermon. And you know who would do the shortest? Mark. Mark had a sense of urgency and immediacy about him, a drivenness. He starts his gospel with John the Baptist. And in a way, that voice from heaven, "This is my son in whom I am well pleased," frames the beginning of this gospel, and the Roman centurion at the end who says, "This indeed is the Son of God," brackets and ends the gospel. And everything in between is written to sustain that witness. Some people have described the Gospel of Mark as an introduction with a passion narrative. There's a sense of the rapid pace of Mark as he describes. He's a minimalist when it comes to description in order to give maximum attention to Jesus Christ. The events that have led up to this particular passage in the Gospel of Mark are a kind of collage of high-impact pictures in which the Jesus that's presented there is a controversial figure. He runs against the expectations that everyone had for the Messiah. He is hanging out with the undesirables. His magnetism is attracting large crowds, but in a way that truly conflicts with what the religious leaders feel should be happening. He has a particular slant, it would seem, on the demonic, and evil spirits are somehow drawn out by his presence. He has powers to heal in a way that reminds people of the promise that the prophets gave. But still, as a figure that struck them as the Messiah, he is not meeting those expectations and therefore is so controversial. There are four things that I'd like to focus on as we move to the table. The first is the installation of the apostles. This happens just before our passage that we read. And then the intervention that friends or associates give in Jesus' life. They intervene because they think he needs it, which is a remarkable picture, isn't it? And then the third is the indictment by the religious leaders of Jesus. And fourth, the inclusion. Our four pictures of Jesus will conclude with Jesus looking at the people seated around him in a crowded house, saying, "My mother, my brothers, my sisters are those who do the will of God." So first, the installation of the apostles. And this, again, is done in brief by Mark. He says that Jesus went up the mountain. And in that region of Galilee, Mount Arbel, the cliffs of Arbel, would probably be the most logical place to be described as a mountain. Not hills, but a mountain. And it overlooks the whole area of northern Galilee. And it's beautiful. There's nothing that's been built on that. I was there 3 weeks ago. Stood maybe where Jesus summoned the apostles and made them who they are. One of the impressions that you get in being in Galilee is that everything is so close. You can be on a boat on the Sea of Galilee and see Capernaum, see Magdala, See, the place where Jesus fed the 5,000, it's all right there. There's an immediacy about it. And Mount Arbel looks over it all. So much of Jesus' ministry can be taken in one visualization. There are three things that Mark impresses upon us as to the reason for the appointment of the apostles. One is he summoned them, made them, and it's the same language out of Genesis 1. He made the heavens and the earth. It doesn't seem like it's left to their discretion or whether or not they want to. The weight of emphasis falls on the fact that God has summoned them and they have responded. And the first thing that Jesus wants from them is to be with him. To be with him. We can do that. We can do that. We can be with him. The second thing will be preaching the gospel. The third thing will be casting out demons. You may say, well, I don't know about those two last two, but first, yes, you can be with him. Jesus enters a house, and immediately a crowd gathers, so much so, and so intense is his ministry that the disciples can't even eat. And hearing that, his friends or his associates, and it's vague, we don't really know who this is. Some translations are family, some friends, some associates. In other words, they see themselves as somewhat responsible for Jesus. The church often frames itself in that kind of feeling of responsibility. In the prophet, Zechariah speaks of the family being responsible when a child faces difficulty, especially when the child seems to be going off. And here, friends, associates, or family, they show up, and we're told that they wanted to take charge of Jesus. Interesting language, because the take charge of Jesus is going to be the same language that is used of Pilate and the Roman centurions taking charge of Jesus. They think that he's lost his mind. Now, this is interesting. The presentation of Jesus is such that it actually means that positive people, responsible people, feel that they need to step in and take charge of Jesus. Of course, this is ludicrous. Who's going to take charge of the Word that's made flesh and dwells among us? Who's going to take charge of the one who's casting out evil spirits? Who's going to take charge of the one who's healing and feeding? Who's going to take charge of this justice-bearing, teaching, powerful teaching figure that has come? It reminds me of what C.S. Lewis says famously, and everybody's heard this quote from Mere Christianity, where he says that in the mouth of any other person, saying what Jesus was saying would be considered either silly or conceited to the nth degree. And Lewis goes on to say, I'm trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. This is the one thing we must not say, Lewis says. A man who is merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level of the man who says he's a poached egg, or else he'd be the devil of hell himself. You have to make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else he's a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool. You can spit at him. You can kill him as a demon. Or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let's not come at him with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He's not left that open to us. He didn't intend to. That in turn reminded me of U2's Bono, in an interview where he was asked, what or who is Jesus? And Bono said this. He said, Jesus went around claiming to be the Messiah, the Son of God, and that is why he was crucified. He was crucified because he said he was the Son of God. So either he was the Son of God, or he was. And at that point, the interviewer interrupted Bono with not, or he was not. But Bono shot back, no, no, no. If he wasn't the Son of God, he was nuts. Forget rock and roll messianic complexes. It's more like Charles Manson delirium. So the interview asked, therefore it follows that you believe that Jesus was divine and rose from the dead physically. And Bono said, yes, I don't have any problem with miracles. I live around them. I am one. So friends came to take charge of Jesus because they thought he was out of his mind. Maybe some of your friends, because of the way you follow Jesus, think you are out of your mind. And I'll just leave that right there. And then the teachers of the law who came down from Jerusalem said, he's possessed by Beelzebub. The reason he's got these powers over evil spirits is because he himself is evil. And Jesus, understanding what they were thinking and what they were saying among themselves, began to speak to them in implication, in parable, in figures. He's drawing comparisons here. He's making an analogy. And he says, how can Satan drive out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, the kingdom cannot stand. You've heard this before. It is interesting that there are cultures that are much more concerned about evil spirits and demons and the devil than our Western culture is. I do believe that the biblical account of evil is a wise account, is a sane account. That evil cannot be completely accounted for by the human condition, but the power of evil, the intensity of evil, actually transcends the human condition in a perverted, demonic way. You recall that Jesus said, I saw Satan falling like lightning. That in the face of the incarnate one, the devil has been bound, and he uses the same language of binding the strong man for binding Satan. And the Apostle John in the book of Revelation will use that same language for the binding of Satan, for a curtailment, for a reduction, for a limitation of the power of Satan so that the gospel can go forth. And those demonic powers are for once and all defeated at the cross in the triumph of God's grace and mercy. But the consummation, the culmination awaits Christ's return. There's a lot to believe here for 21st century Western postmodern people. But it's what we believe when we take the bread and we take the cup. We affirm something very radical. You know, this goes way beyond any kind of modernist, fundamentalist, liberal, evangelical. This is what Christians confess. And this is why the world at times thinks that Jesus himself is insane, or Jesus himself is demon-possessed. Jesus is a controversial figure. The indictment of the religious leaders. And I should draw attention to verse 28. Truly, I tell you, or I most solemnly declare to you, people can be forgiven all their sins and every slander they utter. What good news is that, huh? No matter what we do, no matter how evil we are, there is forgiveness. That line is, you need to underscore that. Truly, I tell you, people can be forgiven all their sins and every slander they utter. But whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit will never be forgiven. They are guilty of eternal sin. So what is that sin? That unpardonable sin? It is this, that one persists in claiming that Jesus is evil. That the one who came to save, who came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many, that one is evil. That he's a liar, he's a lunatic. And to persist in that is to violate the witness of the Holy Spirit. And the form of that witness comes in so many ways that you have to reject. There's a long, long list of the way the Holy Spirit convinces and compels and draws people to himself through the grace and mercy of Jesus Christ. Verse 30, he said this because they were saying he has an impure spirit. And then, again, Mark, he transitions so quickly. Then Jesus' mother and brothers arrive. And they are standing outside. You get the picture, huh? There are those on the outside, friends and associates who think Jesus is crazy. Those on the outside, the religious leaders who indict Jesus as an evil spirit. And now, his mother and his brothers, they show up. And Jesus is on the inside with a crowd of intense people. And the crowd is sitting around him. And they told him, your mother and brothers are outside looking for you. And Jesus asked a question. Well, who are my mother and brothers? Who really are they? And Jesus now will redefine the family. Now that's shocking truth. Where blood runs so much thicker than faith in so many cultures. Here, faith runs thicker than blood. My real family. He looked at those seated in a circle around him and said, here are my mother and brothers. Whoever does God's will is my mother, my brother, and sister. The crowd's sitting around him. Well, that goes back, and if I were choosing lectionary readings for this Mark 3, I would make 2 Samuel 7 one of those lectionary readings, because it is where David expresses his desire to build a temple for the Lord. He has built his palace. The Ark of the Covenant is under a tent. He's feeling badly about that. He goes to Nathan the prophet and says, what do you think of this idea? Building a temple for the Ark of the Covenant. Nathan says, that's great. Whatever's in your heart, go and do it. And that night, God speaks to Nathan and says, no way. I don't want David building a house for me. I'm building a house for David. And that news is delivered to David. And David leaves his palace. He walks out under the tent where the Ark of the Covenant is. He covers himself with ashes and he prays. And he sits. And it's so interesting. Presbyterian commentators, Walter Brueggemann, Eugene Peterson, they say this kind of sitting is the most important kind of thing that David ever did. Greater than Goliath, greater than respecting the Lord's anointed in Saul, because it underscores the justification that we have by faith and not by works. This is where it begins. Sitting. Sitting in full dependence upon the grace and mercy of God. Knowing that our salvation does not come as a result of our achievement, that life is always defined more by what we receive than by what we achieve. It begins here, sitting with Christ in the center. And we do that together as brothers and sisters and mothers in the Lord. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.